there, I'm Diane Callahan, developmental editor and YouTuber quotidian writer. I'm here with Casey Norton, who wrote the first book in Story Garden's Dragoncoat Chronicles, which is an alternate history of 1920s America with dragons. And it is the Stone Dragon and the Moonshine Molly. And I love this cover so much. That is our Bookfly design plug, but I really love the covers of this series.
It's got a little naked baby dragon on it.
Naked baby, yes, there is a baby dragon on it. That's how you know it's fantasy with the historical plus the fantasy. But I mean, and that's what we're going to talk about today, though, is looking at this as an alternate history novel. So for those who aren't aware, alternate history is like a subgenre of fiction where historical events happen differently than they did in real life. So I always think of The Man in the High Castle by Philip K. Dick, and so that's where an alternate, World War II novel where, what would happen if Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan won the war instead. So for the Dragoncoat series, though, this is a world where there's speakeasies and rumrunners in the 1920s, but there's also dragon riders. And you kind of see how dragons as existing in the world has changed 1920s America and the rest of the world, too. That historical fiction, fantasy blend with it. Also has romance.
Yep.
So it's a whole vibe with this whole book, with this whole series, which I love. So you mentioned to me before this interview that you have a general interest in alternate history. So, what got you into that?
Well, so some of the first short stories that I wrote that have come out in a couple different publications are alternate science fiction, but like slightly alternate history, but the science of those worlds is also closer to historical understandings of science than, what actually works. So, for example, what if instead of Darwin being right, Lamarck was right? Oh. And so, how would evolution work and what kind of beings would exist? And then how would that impact the world that they lived in some cases, like really small ways. But
wow, it's like alternate science fiction. I like that.
Yeah,
that's really cool.
Exactly. So that's something that I really enjoy, just the kind of thinking about what if this worked in a slightly different way, and then how would that kind of ripple out, and if it's just like one teeny tiny thing, like maybe not in a huge way, if there are dragons living in the world and people have figured out how to tame them and use them as kind of cavalry. How does that change everything?
Yes.
It's certainly a much larger ripple effect.
Yes, absolutely. Oh my gosh. So in general, we're going to just talk about the idea of alternate history as a subgenre for writers. So as a writer, how do you even begin to build an alternate history?
I ask no. One of the things that there are like the large things that change, and then the small things that what wouldn't necessarily change a huge amount. So there were some things, for example, in this one that ended up being, stop signs at this particular time are still yellow, because why wouldn't they be? Like researching the actual, making sure that some of the details are still accurate that wouldn't have any reason to change, so that it still feels, lived in, and it doesn't feel like it just, I just put down whatever I thought of, right? I mean, my background is in history and archaeology, so I also am a nerd.
Oh my gosh, such a nerd. I love it.
So, but then with this, when we were talking about this more, it's like, okay, so what if it was this time period, but there were dragons? Well, what else would change? What else would how would World War I go? What would happen before that? What would happen? Okay, so in the 1600s, if Ethiopia had dragons, how would that?
Wow, it's like asking a lot of questions. That's kind of the basis of it. Yeah.
Yeah, and having enough of an understanding of the things that wouldn't necessarily change, or in some cases it's a flavor, keeping the flavor the same. So even if it maybe something might have played out differently, but you don't want, if you go too far, then it stops being alternate history and just becomes a whole like secondary world.
Yeah, how do you know that you don't go too far and start asking too many questions where you're like, well, Ethiopia's not even going to be in this story, but
I have no idea.
You're like, I have not stopped.
Keep going. I mean, I could, but we figured out, some points, like, okay, this is a point where it would really start to diverge, because if you go too far back, then you're just going to end up, like I said, with a whole other thing. And yeah, I'm sure there are some things that were like, well, but we want to keep this the same. So like, well, let's just figure out a way, don't look too closely at that. Right. Yes. So, but then there were certainly some things that we went, okay, well, for one of them, how would Napoleon, how would that have gone if there were dragons involved? It really changes how the technology that you have doesn't necessarily give you a huge advantage over
Mm-hmm.
people. It really changes what colonialism does or doesn't look like,
Mm-hmm.
because you've kind of leveled the playing field a little bit by adding this like giant animal that's assisting you. And it's like, okay, those have guns, but we've got dragons, so like, whatever.
Yes, no, that's so true. The levels of technology. I'm thinking of Legend of Korra, which isn't
Mhm.
really alternate history, but it has
Yeah.
like the industrial age flavor plus fantasy. And I think that's something that really intrigues me in fantasy. It's almost like it's not steampunk or anything, but it's like almost science fantasy
Yeah.
realm. And I think I find that super fascinating. Like having technology and essentially magic or dragons coexist is like a really interesting concept. So
Well, and I tend to do a thing where I'll get in there and be like, okay, well, is it okay to include this type of dishware? Well, if it's from this particular place at this particular time, yeah, they'd probably be like doing kind of about the same thing, or like, oh, we can't have it be from there though because we've totally diverged from world history, so like, don't include that kind of dishware. Like,
yes. Well, I love that attention to detail, though. I think that's really important. It makes it interesting. It keeps things interesting for you as the writer too.
yes,
To like,
I
do
like to
that.
make it difficult for myself.
So that's always good. But yeah, so like diving into that, like, what is your research process like? Like, what kind of sources do you look into?
So I actually I used for this some kind of similar stuff. I've done some Western historical romance, and so I ended up finding a lot of resources that I could use for that. So one, this doesn't give anything away. It's a story that's under NDA, but no one will ever know. Where I wanted to have a character give another character some perfume, right, as like a gift. So I was going, okay, well, I've got to figure out like what is the average wage of somebody in this time period in this place, and then if what type of perfume would have been popular that year and that season, and if he
Wow.
gives it to her in a special different bottle, how many 29 cents extra for that bottle or whatever. So I was finding all these like old like Macy's catalogs and that kind of thing. So for this, there's more available for this because a lot more stuff has been digitized.
Wow.
But there were a number of things where I was going like, okay, so what kind of, I'll start to do something that I know does not match a timeline, right? It's like it's too early or too late or whatever. So we would kind of figure out like how do we get around that, and what can we include that would make sense and that would add flavor and would actually be realistic enough to ground it in the details, so that it's like, oh yeah, but they're also dragons. Like, don't worry about that too much. But like,
Yeah, so it's sort of like you can use it as plot hole cover if you can come up with a good reason, at least with the fantasy element, because I think it's harder in alternate history where it's in a completely realistic world. You have to come up with different sorts of solutions where something else maybe was invented for whatever reason. There's workarounds for that too, but I think fantasy does give you some leeway to
but having enough, hopefully enough in it that if people are looking into it, there was a particular type of there's a particular object in this book that I actually can't name, but it would be a spoiler. It'd be a clue. There's a murder mystery in here too, as if there aren't enough things going on. But there was something when they solve the clue that they've been looking for the whole time, and they realize it's something other than what they thought it was. It's a specific object that is pretty close to what exists in this world, but that got modified based on the alternate history. So I could look and be like, it's like this thing, but here's why we changed that detail.
Oh, that's neat.
Which to me, like, it's fun.
Yeah.
But it's also, I think, as a reader, when I read, when it's like, oh, you didn't just go, oh, it's alternate history, just make up a bunch of stuff, just kind of do whatever you want. Having enough to kind of anchor it is.
Yeah, kind of using the alternate history as like almost like a plot twist or a way to surprise and delight the reader with how things have changed in really clever ways. I love that. And then with the title of the book, The Stone Dragon and the Moonshine Molly, like what is, like, because that's obvious, it's a very 1920s plus fantasy feel to it, but like what is the connection to the premise of the book with that?
So the Stone Dragon is the main dragon character. Oh yes, we love him very much. Who most of the dragons in this world they're kind of sticky, and they coat themselves in metal as armor. But this particular one is actually a hybrid between a dragon that a different like subspecies than is used in the Eastern Americas. So one of his parents would coat themselves in metal, and one coats themselves in stone. And so he's a little bit special on a lot of levels. But he ends up coating himself in turquoise. And so because he's a because he's a hybrid, he doesn't quite follow the rules that everybody's expecting in terms of biology. So, he's a little element of chaos.
I love that, and I see what that explains the turquoise. There's a ball of turquoise on the cover, so that actually
Yes,
explains
and that's
that.
actually part of the concern is like, where do you source this particular stone based on the
Yeah.
world, the world that exists in we can't just go over to the turquoise mines because those exist on a part of the country that is not America at this point. So that becomes part of the plot, and like, how does that play out, and what does it mean within this particular, okay, because we have this backstory of why it's turquoise, and then there's complication of, where do you source the turquoise? Also, it's kind of a soft stone, so how does that impact what this particular dragon can do, or what kind of missions he'd be sent on, and that kind of thing. So
Wow, and then the Moonshine Molly is
the main character name is Molly.
yeah, got
But
it.
Moonshine Mall, but she owns a speakeasy in a place where the most dragons are concentrated at any given time. It's kind of the central hub of all the dragon flights as they're going around and doing their patrols. So she owns a speakeasy at the base of the landing platform, and Blue Streak is the dragon, and his coat warden is very into following rules, and this is set during Prohibition, so she's breaking all the laws.
Yes.
But is also able to provide assistance to them that nobody else can currently provide. So there's some tension there. But
Yes. Okay, I love that. And it's really interesting to hear how you wove together the kind of alternate history details, and those are like part of the plot. Like the conflict is coming from the alternate history aspect of it. I find that really fascinating. And so, in general, with alternate history, like, what do you think are some of the key things that writers should consider when trying to write in this subgenre?
Figuring out how to keep it, if to make it alternate history, there has to be enough reality that not only one thing with this is not just like, if I can justify it, that doesn't necessarily mean it should make it into the book, because it might not feel like the right. It's like, well, but yeah, it could go this way, but then that's going to maybe make the reader think of something else. So then the flavor still is off, right? So making sure that there's enough of the history element that it makes sense. And one of the things that we've thought a lot about with this one is, in terms of world history, what else changes once we add this element of dragons? It's not just going to be like everything was exactly the same, but there were dragons in it, because there were things that happened in history that would not have happened, or that would have happened in a wildly different way. So being mindful of that.
Yes, for sure. Especially like how you depict world wars and how that changes too.
Yes.
For sure, it's a really big scale of things changing.
I do want to say one. I won't name names, but one of the things that I think about, there's a fantasy series that I had read at one point that was set in a fantastical version of slightly earlier than this, like a Pioneer era, and there are a lot of magical things happening in the landscape. There are kind of magical beasts and magical plants and things, and the person who wrote it was concerned about getting depictions of Native Americans wrong. So the person chose not to include any humans in the country. So it's just settlers, just colonists coming through, because, that it potentially avoided a conflict in that person's mind. But for me as a reader, I haven't gone back to anything that person's done, because you've basically just gone like, I just don't want to have to deal with it. So I think with history, we've talked a little with fantasy stuff.
Yep.
There are fantasy elements in it, but when you're dealing with history, you still have to be mindful of what you're changing and why you're changing and who that impacts and what that implies.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think that's a really big thing that writers need to consider with it, because history is, sensitive and fraught, and, it's filled with a lot of different complications and nuances, and you really have to find ways to address that and be true to the history in a way that doesn't affect real people in the real world. So I was wondering, like, what are some historical details that you wove into the novels that you're really proud of?
The main Molly has in her speakeasy, she has a wall of mugs, and it's part of her display. It's part of her her dad used to get them for her or whatever. And I researched so many different types of like mugs and dishware and that kind of thing. So it would be like every time that somebody mentions that display, there would be like a different something that would get highlighted in there, and then we added an alternate something that is based on history that will show up in a later novel, that there is merchandise for that world that is parallel to merchandise that, you know, you could go to a different place and you're like, oh, you like buy a novelty mug or whatever, and there are things in that world that we made novelty mugs for that was like little details in it that's like, oh yeah, that's going to come back in a later book.
Yeah, so pay attention to the mugs. That's what she's saying, is that like
But-
if you read across books, then there's like Easter egg mugs across it.
Yes.
That's
yeah,
really fun.
We got some frog stuff in there, so
Frog stuff.
yeah.
But so when thinking about alternate history, like what are some books that come to mind as really memorable examples? Like even if it's not just books, but like movies, TV shows, video games.
Well, I don't get out much, so all I have is books. No.
No, yeah.
But yeah, I was just thinking about Dread Nation by
Oh, yeah.
Justina Ireland.
Mhm.
I just the second, it's a duology, and the second one came out a little while ago, and I've started reading some more of her stuff. But that's essentially like a Civil War era zombie apocalypse.
Yeah.
And so she's kind of dealing with a lot of, because she has a starting point that's like it's real world up until this point.
Mhm.
Then how that plays out ends up being, you know, she's staying pretty close to history up until there. So I very, very much recommend that series. And it's a little bit more speculative, but still alternate history. There's the first, in English, the first one is The Map of Time by Felix J. Palma. It was it's a trilogy that was written in Spanish initially, and it's kind of there's like alternate history, like H.G. Wells, War of the Worlds, a bunch of that stuff from that going on, and it's a combination of actual history, historical figures, and the stories that they wrote as though they are part of the historical world.
Wow, that's a lot.
And the first there's a twist. I'm not allowed to do spoilers. There is a twist at the end of book 2 that kind of like almost just, it was just such a mind.
Wow.
My brain just melted a little bit,
That's
you know.
so
When I was
cool.
reading it, I was like, oh yeah, like this is fun, haha, this is interesting. Oh, this is paralleling this historical stuff. And then I got to the end of book 2, and I was like, I didn't even know you could do that. So that's that. I haven't read. You know, I read those when those were coming out, and those are still like one of my favorite trilogies of all time. So
Wow, that's really impressive. Like, yeah, that sounds like the author really had to know a lot about the real world history in order to almost
and also
subvert
the
it.
literature that the real world figures that he's using in
Yeah.
there. So there are a lot of literary jokes from like you know like Poe and H.G. Wells, and yeah, it's very clever. But I feel like it's one where even if you don't know, it's fine because he tells you everything that you need to know to appreciate the stories. But as somebody who had studied a lot of that stuff and who reads a lot, and I was like, I see what you did there. You know, that's very funny, and I'm like I'm the target audience.
Wow, that's really cool.
But I do think it stands alone, even if you don't get all the little, you know, it's like Easter eggs, but
Mhm.
you don't need that background to understand the story. So
Yeah, and I think that is helpful for alternate history. I don't think that, you know, you can kind of provide context in the story because
Yeah.
your reader isn't going to know every single historical detail. I think most of
Right.
the time the authors have like a much bigger background knowledge than
Yeah.
most of their readers, but it's like you want to be able to please the people who know as much or more than you, but then also that the people that don't know anything can also enjoy the story.
I mean, I think for any type of genre, I mean, I guess contemporary, this doesn't necessarily apply, but if I get the impression that I could, you know, I'm reading a book and that I could talk to the person who wrote it and be like, I have this question, and they go, oh, I have a whole notebook full of that stuff, and I'm one of those. One
Yes.
of those. If you're like, oh, you want to know why we changed this one aspect of French history? Well, let me tell you.
yeah.
It's not just like, oh, because it was interesting to do it that way. It's like, no, if you plan this out, and then this map that we have over here from this, you know. Anyway, so I think anything where the world building, you know, fantasy, speculative fiction, historical, where you've actually put that, it's not just what's on the page, it's there's other stuff off the page that's driving it, and that maybe, like in this series, there are going to be things that aren't even necessarily plot points, but
Mhm.
that kind of weave through all of them,
Yes.
or pop up in this one and then show up again 4 books later. So
Yes, and I mean that speaks to needing a very good world building Bible so that you can keep track of all the changes, especially if you're doing a series. Like in one book, maybe you could get away with not having one,
Yeah.
but then like doing multiple books across the series.
well, and because these are collaborative, so we've got other people
Yes.
working on stuff, we have to have shared resources of like, oh, you changed this thing, well, now
Mhm.
that's going to affect what I do in my
yes.
storyline, and for this one, there are some, characters who will show up in one book that will show up again later. So having other things that they interact seated in the book where they first showed up, one of the side character in this is going to be a main character in another one, which is my favorite. And but then there are also details in the world that get seated in this book that will show up in something where that character is not present, and then actually come back to her plot. It just makes me very happy.
Wow. Yeah. No, it has to be. It's all really threaded together, like with the characters and the world and like all the details. Yeah, it's a lot of work, but I mean, I think that it's like obviously you're very passionate about it, and I know that Jordan, our our boss, who is also he is the collaborator on this novel, Jordan Riley Swan. Writing also is Riley Rookhouse on our other series, so I think that everybody here is very plot-oriented, planner-oriented to some degree, where like we keep good track.
Hyper-fixated, hyper-focused, yeah.
Yes, there's that. But yeah, so if you want to read the series, the Dragoncoat Chronicles series, so we have the first book in it is the Stone Dragon and the Moonshine Molly, so that is that Prohibition era dragon goodness with
welcome to the Roaring Twenties.
Oh my gosh, yes, you can do it at least once, where that we'll definitely have a video with the radio style. Yes, it's wonderful. But yeah, thank you everybody for joining us, and thank you to Casey Norton for joining me too. So we'll see you next time in our story garden.